The Alex Ovechkin era is entering its final days. Since breaking into the playoffs in 2008, it has brought a very mixed bag of feelings to Capitals fans across each of its 24 playoff series. And now, with the era likely entering its final year, I think it's a good time to have a celebration, a ranking of them, because each of them tells their own unique story. But this isn't just my opinion. No. This is using a staggeringly in-depth but equally arbitrary formula. Basically, most people believe consciously or otherwise that a longer series usually means it's a better one, along with how close the game was, how good the action was, and at the end of the day, how much each team came to play. The series averages are fed into this monstrosity of an equation to calculate a series score. The presentation will look something like this. Each game has its own individual data, and at the end you can see the average for the series, which is what is used to calculate its final place. Every game also gets its own score calculated, just for reference. At the bottom of the screen for each series, I have added 3 modifiers which provide extra context. There's the fun to watch modifier, which removes the length of series factor and only looks at how well and evenly played the series was. There's the box score modifier, which removes the balance of play factor and just calculates the length of the series and stats related to excitement. In other words, how good you'd think the series was if you had only seen the box score and the stats. Lastly, the war modifier, which removes the score imbalance weight, looking at how long and evenly played the series was even if the score got out of hand. Basically, it's the series the 2011 Cup final epitomizes. Playoff hockey makes us laugh, makes us cry, but particularly in the case of the Ovechkin era, sometimes it makes you want therapy. It gets really, really stressful, win or lose. In the series ranking, there are 5 pretty distinct sections, so I've split them into 5 rooms, each with increasingly intense methods of therapy to help deal with the increasingly stressful greatness of playoff hockey. And in this era, there is a lot of it. So let's get us all a little warmed up with some light entertainment type series before we get into the more hardcore stuff. It's a little contrived of a metaphor, but I wanted an excuse to make some cool graphics. Room 1 is the self-care room. It holds the trio of series that aren't really going to be living in your head and keeping you up at night the way more exciting series would. In the moment, they may be a little rattling, but nothing a 3-hour phone call to your friend or a bucket of Haagen-Dazs won't wash away. On said phone, you can bellyache all you want about Washington's first-round series against Philadelphia in 2016. According to my model, it is the worst series of the Ovechkin era, despite going 6 games. Now, though the score was generally close, 2016 was Washington's best regular season ever, and with the exception of Game 2, the Caps played like it. They jumped out to a 3-0 series lead before Michael Neuwirth replaced Steve Mason to make it kind of interesting, nearly pushing it all the way to 7. But the conclusion was already foregone. It was low scoring, lead holding, and a formality, with no overtimes. But in Game 3, when the Caps all but shut the door on the Flyers' season, the Philly faithful threw their Ed Snyder memorial bracelets on the ice in the most Philly deed to ever Philly. It's not a good sign when that's the thing the series is most remembered for. If you look just over the Haagen-Dazs, you'll see my personal choice for the worst series. The bubble first-round series against the Islanders. This one sucked. It had been months since we'd seen hockey, and honestly, the bubble playoffs didn't feel like real hockey to me. But maybe that's because, despite going up against their recently released coach in Barry Trotz, the Capitals got schooled. Everything went wrong. They couldn't convert chances, they let the Isles dance around them, Holtby was terrible. I could keep going, but the bottom line is, after finding themselves at the business end of a 3-0 hole, that was it. No poetic defeat of their old coach, no cup for Kovalchuk, no payoff for what I believe to be the last season of true cup contention in the Ovechkin era. I mean, that lineup was really, really good at the time. I could say that if the season wasn't canceled, maybe we would have seen a different result. But you could say that for any team that year. This one does kinda live in my head, maybe more than this categorization would indicate. Partially for the reasons described, but also because Anders Lee concussed Nick Backstrom with a late hit in Game 1 that knocked him out of the series. But that's all a pretty big laundry list of excuses for a series that the Capitals just were never in. The bout in one word: embarrassing. The Capitals had something to prove after being upset by Montreal in 2010, and in their second matchup against the Rangers in 3 years, they got their second series win. It was all but clinched after a 3-goal third-period comeback to take a stranglehold on the series in Game 4. This was the first series in 5 tries to not go the full distance, and while that hurts the series' overall score, Caps fans could use a break from the heart attacks. The series featured some new heroes for the Caps, Jason Arnott, Jason Chimera, Marcus Johansson, and both their appearances and a 4-1 series win put the league on notice that the Caps were still a contender. I mean, aside from a fluky last-minute goal against in Game 3, this very well could have been the only 4-game sweep in Capitals history. Like I said for all 3 in this room, it's not the kind of series that's going to keep you up at night. None of them are. But while it wasn't overly stressful, it was then a high point for a revived Capitals franchise. The next room is for playoff series that, while not totally forgettable, are still unremarkable. A notch above in terms of stress, they're the kinds of upsetting that maybe you need to assume a recumbent posture beside an alienist or two to sort out how you feel about it. To work through it, you might need to see someone with oak paneling and classical busts in their office once or twice to get those latent hang-ups out into the open. That's a pretty accurate barometer reading for my feelings towards 21st on the list. Making the playoffs this last year was such a stretch goal for the Capitals that it does kind of soothe the sting of not winning a single game. I kept waiting for various names to finally break out of their slumps. Ovechkin, Pacioretty, Protas, but it just never ended up happening. This is the second series in which the Capitals were swept in the Ovechkin era, and honestly, the numbers don't really indicate that kind of disparity. In the 5 gamers against the Rangers and the Islanders, the team that nearly swept the losers certainly played to that level, but here, the Capitals actually held about 55% of expected goals for at 5-on-5, which against the President's Trophy winning team is great. Unfortunately, once you factor in special teams, that number drops to 46.05, a 9-point swing, which speaks to how potent the Rangers' power play was. Some may even say it's what carried them to the East Final. I swear that's not sublimation or projection, Doctor. It's facts-based, and definitely not the reason I make excuses for this series. So, the Caps played well enough to make it competitive, but the outcome was never really in doubt, and the Rangers' firepower ensured it. There was also just a lot of injurious plays. Oshie got a head hit from Panarin, Iorio separated his shoulder courtesy of Lafreniere, Ballenstein got an elbow from Rempe, Van Riemsdyk got creamed by Rempe, Carlson got charged by Rempe. Not one I want to revisit. Except to watch Hendrix Lapierre's goal in Game 4. That guy is gonna be good. Here's one that's gonna surprise you. Coming in at 20th is the 2018 Eastern Conference Final against Tampa. Here's where I'd say we crossed the line from most forgettable to least good series, because it was 7 games, and one of only a few series on this list where there were 2 series lead changes, which is surprising considering the Caps, fresh on the heels of eliminating the Penguins, smacked the Lightning for a 2-0 series lead, and the Lightning weren't really in either game, at least score-wise. The modifiers at the bottom of your screen place it 24th of 24 until you get to the battle ranking, how long and evenly played the series was. By virtue of the fact that we got 7 games of hockey, and that despite the score, both teams by and large brought the same amount of oomph to the ice, this was an alright series. If you could watch these games while just kinda erasing the scoreboard, just drubbing away the most vital piece of hockey visual, then this was the 5th best series of them all. Unfortunately, we don't live in that reality. It has the highest goal time margins of any series by a mile. So the Capitals mopping up the Lightning in games 1 and 2 hurts the series, along with the Lightning coming right back to do the same in games 3 and 5. Although games 6 and 7 resulted in 2 shutouts, they didn't feel like duds. In game 6, the Capitals' domination facing elimination was the most exhilarating game I've probably ever seen, which the stats kind of back up. And game 7 was never really out of reach until the last period, and even then the teams were playing so evenly that the stats definitely do back that up. The reason this one made me come to see you, Doctor, is because of the dreaded game of inches. There were so many plays in this series, and in Game 7 in particular, where things were just so close to going the wrong way for the Caps, but didn't. It happened a lot in the 2018 run in general, and this run is what made me realize how much winning a championship in a league this skilled, ironically, comes down to luck. "19th on our list, and one that probably lives rent-free in the heads of the Capitals themselves, is the 2021 first-round series against the universally admired and respected Boston Bruins. This was the first series where I truly knew, the whole time I was watching it that the Capitals were going to lose. Not thought they might lose, like in their days of choking, knew they would. Despite there being 4 overtime periods in 5 games, it never really felt close. The Caps blew 2 leads in Game 1, but one thanks to Children of Jesus Nick Dowd and TJ Oshie. They blew a third-period lead in Game 2 and lost. They blew a third-period lead in Game 3 and lost. And they never led again. You could smell the choke on this one. You could just tell the Caps just kept letting Boston pour it on in third periods, and their goalie situation was a perpetual disaster, and they had injuries, just blah. Funny enough, if the last 2 games weren't dominated by the Bruins to close out the Caps, this series would likely rank much higher because of how highly it regards games 1 through 3, frustrating though they all are. I mean, look at all those zeros, and they're really high event too. That is about as good of a start to a series as you can hope to watch. But after the Samsonov-Schultz overtime gaffe in Game 3, any pretense of it being a close series withered and died. But that's what it's like to root for the Caps in the playoffs. The very best games were the ones that they lost, and they sent you off to get psychoanalyzed. Uh-oh. This was the first real choke job of the Ovechkin era. Against Philly, it was a rebuilding team's first playoff series. Against Pittsburgh, well, they were the better team and ended up winning the cup. But this is Jaro Halak being a black hole in net. The man was an event horizon, and like a supermassive gravity well, he made thousands of people's heads get torn off and explode the more they were involved with him. But there's no excuse. The Habs couldn't score, Carey Price was out of the picture, the Caps won the President's Trophy that year for the love of Peter Gabriel, but they somehow found a way to lose a 3-1 series lead. If you remember, they actually lost the era-leading 106 scoring chance Game 1 in overtime, and that's when the word choke started getting thrown around. But Ovechkin and Backstrom did their thing to roar back for 3 straight wins, and we thought, oh, what fools we were to think the Capitals were choking. Well, they were. The puck just hadn't made its way down their throats yet. To their credit, the Capitals totally dominated this series up and down, and it was solely because of Jaro Halak that this series remained close at any point. But the Caps couldn't come away with it. You know what's sad? The Capitals trucked Montreal with a 61.57% overall expected goals for percentage. So cumulatively, which means a lot seeing as this was a 7-game series, this was probably the best round the Capitals played in the Ovechkin era. But in the end, that didn't matter. It was a massive psychological blow for the Capitals and their fan base, one that they would never really recover from. I'm still waiting on my Valium. If losing in 2010 to the Canadiens was like opening up a deep cut, and the latter losses were subsequent infections, the 2016 loss to the Penguins was like realizing you'd have to amputate. It was a pretty low-scoring series, what with it being 2016 and all, and I was 17 and mood-swingy as hell when this was airing, so stats are really the only way I can objectively look at it anymore. The Capitals were once again regular season champions, a phrase which should make anyone serious about winning instantly flaccid. It should have been a warning sign when they failed to sweep the Flyers, but nonetheless, they quickly found themselves being outplayed and outdueled. Game 1 was fantastic, a classic Caps-Pens affair that saw 2 lead changes, a statistical rarity, and a baller 68 scoring chances with a pristine 3.96% difference in play, and no time with a goal or more difference. That is basically immaculate. The Caps got worked in Game 2, the scoreboard is a damn liar, and then in Game 3, they lost in a classically Capitals way as they dominated, but couldn't score. Both of those 2 games have the 2 worst expected goals for differentials of all 140-plus games. Games 4, 5, and 6 were pretty smart-looking affairs, but although the Caps battled back from a 3-goal deficit in the third period of Game 6, imagine if it didn't have that score differential. But despite the comeback, despite how good of a game it was, despite how close the Caps were to forcing a Game 7, Bonino. 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 Words don't really do it justice. It was the height of frustration for Capitals underachieving. It was gutting. The Caps really felt like they were destined for it all that year. But the Penguins were built from blitzkrieg head to toe, and they punched the Caps in the mouth. And my lip is still swollen. Let's end the room on a happy note. Number 16 on our list was the Ovechkin Era's first playoff series win. Now, I was kind of surprised to see the series this low, but looking more closely at the numbers, it becomes obvious why. Despite a pretty hefty amount of time in games 3 through 6 with a big score differential, as well as a sizable play imbalance in favor of the Capitals, we remember it so fondly because Game 7 left us all with a classic. The lasting image of this bout was Sergei Fedorov blowing the roof off of Verizon Center at the end of an all-time game in Caps history. The 6 games before it were not that. Game 1 was pretty good, but every other game in between is marked with either one-sided play or a scoreboard that read winning team 4, losing team gone conclusion. That was terrible. Please don't go away. Please don't leave me here. Honestly, after rewatching this series, it's okay. It's just okay. Aside from being the first Ovechkin Era series win, and the Fedorov goal being one of the most important goals in franchise history, there isn't much else to write home about. But again, that's by hockey playoff standards. The bar is already really high. I mean, come on, we're in a psychoanalyst's office. We'd be discussing things like microscopic deflections and bounces of random chance all day long if we wanted to. Game 7 actually had a bounce go the Caps way that the Rangers fans were salty about. So maybe this psychoanalyst's room is for them. I think our time is up anyway. When the playoffs get more tense, with a more baseline level of nail-biting, tummy-aching, or swan-diving for happiness at the bottom of a bottle, that's when we really need to start looking for alternative methods of coping. Methods outside of traditional medicine. Methods like a sweat lodge. The kind of place that reeks of bunkum. The place that promises an all-natural experience, but all the faucets are motion-activated. That kind of fake, new age stuff. Out in the mountains of Utah where you primally scream and throw tree trunks to get in touch with your masculine side. You know, that kind of drivel that only sounds cool, but in practice makes you realize how much jungle air makes your back itch. That's the kind of therapy the series of this level will demand of you. For my part, I know nothing made me want to run away to a hut in the woods quite like the Capitals' 2017 loss to the Penguins. If I may be allowed to extend the metaphor, if the 2016 loss to the Penguins was like having to get an infected limb amputated, the 2017 loss was the realization that you'd have to live the rest of your life that way, incompletely. And there was nothing you could do. You've heard me say it before, and I'll say it again. The Capitals played so well in this series. In games 1 through 6, they didn't choke, the Penguins clutched. All they needed was one look to make you pay. But game 7? Yeah, that's a choke. Yevgeny Kuznetsov said it was like a completely different team came out to play. Those expected goals for percentage differentials all favor the Capitals, except game 7 with a massive swing the other way. At this point, I was just so numb to the Capitals losing. They'd lost in every way, in every scenario, it seemed, to the point where I felt like I knew more about what it takes to lose than to win. This series followed after the mind-achingly stressful Toronto series, and was even more stressful to watch, but not so much because of the actual play, so much as it was a Pavlovian response to playing the Penguins. It was a fact that they were going to win. And in games 1 and 2, they were destroyed, but broke the Capitals' backs to steal them both anyway. Doesn't matter that it was among the most lopsided 7-game series of the last 20 years. Pens won. It doesn't matter that the Capitals' roster seemed once again destined to win it all. Pens won. Doesn't matter that Pittsburgh is a city with a cliff on one side, spaghetti bridges on the other, and B-tier museums in the middle. Pens won. And their fans danced on the steps of Capital One Arena because they knew they could. They knew they were untouchable. Like a dictatorial political party at the peak of their powers. Oh yeah, this series definitely necessitates me screaming my lungs out in the Rockies as the rest of my commune goes back to the lodge for cuddle therapy. Or something. I don't know what people do at places like this. But If I could actually cuddle any series, it would surely be number 14, the 2018 Stanley Cup Final versus the Vegas Golden Knights. I hope you held onto your hats because we just went from the crushing depths of the Capitals franchise to its soaring heights. Now, one note, I seem to remember Game 3 being better than its score would indicate, but that may just be the bias of the home crowd going ballistic at the success of the home team. Because in Game 3, the Caps began to pull away, first controlling the puck in that game, and then the scoreboard in Game 4. Game 4's score disparity hurts the series quite a bit, since one game is 20% of a 5-game series. I hated the Golden Knights. I hated their pre-game carnival. I hated their victim complex. I hated Jonathan Marchessault's unnaturally white teeth. But most of all, I hated their success. Obviously, the Capitals won, so that's nice, but in victory I was also taught a valuable lesson in magnanimity, which would be useful, but I don't know what that word means. It seemed like nobody could beat the Knights. Nobody. Imagine this plucky little army of cast-offs appears out of the blue and just doesn't stop winning. Ever. It was a team that could only face the Caps to do battle in equal poetry. And as the ticker below indicates, they produced such a closely played series that if it had gone one extra game or two, it would almost certainly be a bona fide classic. But since it was only 5 games, the public discourse doesn't give it its due respect. This was a thriller. Games 1 and 5 were 2 of the best cup openers and cup clinchers of all time. I mean it. Watch them. A combined 6 lead changes, 17 goals, not even a 4% difference in expected goals for, and 3 seconds total where the score wasn't within 1 goal. Fire it into space so aliens see that as mankind's crowning achievement. We believe in aliens at this retreat, don't we? Okay, back to the primal screaming and circle chants. Man, Ovechkin and Nick Backstrom really carried the Caps here. They looked 10 years younger, making plays I hadn't seen them make since I wasn't allowed to sit in the front seat. For Ovechkin in particular, it was his most dominant series in nearly a decade. Unfortunately, every time those two made magic happen, the 18 guys on the other team all chipped in a little, and you felt that gap was going to close. And that feeling kept coming through the first 2 games until we got to Game 3, where the beatings commenced. Remember how I said Caps-Knights was the most evenly played final in the last 2 decades? Well, Caps-Canes is the most evenly played series in the Ovechkin era ever, surpassing even 2018. But this is what Vegas-Washington could have been if it were longer. An overall even series, but with a few outright stomps that bring the average down. When one team crushed the other, they then got crushed in equal measure. When you take every strength into consideration, because if you just look at 5v5, the Capitals got cratered. They were sub 50 in expected goals for in every game except Game 7. They were sub 30%, which is absolutely awful, 3 times. Somehow they won one of those. It's because of everything else outside of 5-on-5 that they were able to take home any Ws. The future might have changed altogether if this no goal by Alex Ovechkin was overturned to tie the game near the end of Game 6. I've seen this be called a goal. With goal interference, who knows anymore. But instead of a tie, the Capitals didn't get the call and completely fell apart. It was a heartbreaker after they blew 2 different 2-goal leads in Game 7 and lost in overtime. But the Canes played as a full 20-man unit and never ever quit. Ovechkin totally carried the team here and made several Canes his bitch, but no one else besides the top line really showed up. This was such an ornery, petty series, I still don't like watching it. Because of it, Canes fans also hate the Caps for some reason, and there was a period of about 2 years where they really tried to force a rivalry that just wasn't there. But it was a damn fine series. It's just a shame that the Caps and Andrei Svechnikov lost. Up next on our list at 12th place, halfway up the rankings, is what I believe will go down as the final competitive series of the Alex Ovechkin era. Round 1, 2022. I didn't think the Caps would win this series. They didn't, in case you didn't know. There was no second part to that. I didn't think they could win until Game 3. That's when I did the one thing you should never ever do as an Ovechkin era Caps fan. I got hopeful. But then they followed the trend they started in last year's series against the Bruins and blew late-game leads and lost 3 of them in a row, twice in OT. Oh man. After the Cup win and after Carolina, the playoff series just weren't really competitive anymore. 2020 and 2021 were formalities more than anything else, but the Panthers series gave us a Caps team that opened that door out to sunlight just long enough for us to believe. And then Garnet Hathaway, who is perfect, hit the post on an empty net that would have sealed Game 4 and given the Caps a 3-1 series lead. Can you guess what happened next? Surely it wouldn't be a last-minute game-tying goal and a spineless OT effort capped off by an OT loss. And then doing that same thing in Games 5 and 6. Seriously, the Caps had a 3-0 lead in Game 5. Oh boy, if we win, we'll have them up against elimination. They escaped it last game, but we'll get them this time. The Panthers scored 5 straight and won. It was 4 years after the Cup win, but it felt exactly like a mid-2010s choke job, as if nothing had changed. But I hasten to remind the audience, the Capitals franchise had changed. It's just pain that is timeless. Here's something interesting I found when looking at every single game's ranking. None of the top 15 games have any multi-goal disparity, except for Vegas-Washington's Game 1, which had 3 seconds of it. At 9th best, Game 5 of this series has over 10 minutes, and even some time with a 3-goal differential. The only reason this game isn't knocked a ways down the rankings is because of that coin flip, razor-thin margin of play. You could balance a pin on that. If the Caps didn't go up 3-0, and the goals were traded evenly with the Panthers, who knows how high up this game gets? All things considered, it was a pretty dang good series. The Capitals gave the juggernaut Panthers everything they could handle and exceeded expectations. If a bounce or two went the other way, they may very well have won this series in heroic fashion. So why am I not happy? Entering this bout, the Rock the Red Era Capitals fanbase was, by my estimation, at its numbest. Yes, they had won their division again, but the 2018 Caps were noticeably inferior to the 2016 and 2017 Caps. Without knowing further context, the stats from this series look pretty nice. A pretty high-scoring, high-event matchup that nearly went the distance, with decently low disparity in score and play. Very nice. Just what you want to see to start the summer. But at the time, there was no such optimism. Nobody thought the Caps would go far, much less further than they had gone in recent history. The Blue Jackets were the hottest team in the second half of the season, and it just seemed like the perfect recipe for an, in quotes, upset. I said some things that exposed my total lack of faith in the Caps, and I'm here on this retreat to learn to accept myself for it. But after 2 games, it was everything the Capitals faithful had come to expect. Game 1 was a thriller in which the Caps blew 2 third-period leads and lost in overtime. Game 2, the Capitals dominated, but blew a 3-1 lead and lost in overtime. There's no rational explanation for how they lost both games. The stars must have just aligned the right way. But one man still had faith. After Game 2, Alex Ovechkin prophesied that the Capitals would tie the series and return to Capital One Arena for Game 5. And they not only did that after 2 more overtime periods, but won Game 5 at home in overtime and closed out the Blues in Game 6. This was a great series. It had an average of 7 goals per game, the highest of all series, and a pretty low score differential, and 2 all-time classics in Games 3 and 5. Game 5 in particular was a doozy. It was the second straight first-round series the Caps had, which featured 4 overtime games. They managed to walk away from this one at .500, 2 wins, 2 losses. And thus, the run to glory began with, arguably, the greatest hill to climb. If this series made you come to a New Age medical retreat, it would be both to make you therapeutically scream out all your joy and all your terror, because the Caps were playing the Penguins next. Again. But first, a short detour into the most forgotten playoff series of the Great Eight's time. The only, and I mean only thing that isn't good about this series is that it could not possibly be any shorter. It was a sweep, which is a crime. Remember, shorter series means that averages are more heavily influenced by each game's score, so maybe if there was a game 5 or 6 that wasn't so good, its ranking would take a bigger hit. But there weren't, so it doesn't. 2011 Bolts is a classic example of a matchup where the series score is completely misleading. The the Capitals had 47.96% of the expected goals, which isn't the upper hand, but it's still right there with Tampa, and the score differential reflects that parity. This series had the fourth lowest score disparity of all, clocking in at an average of 2 minutes and 17 seconds of a 2-goal gap, and 16 seconds of a 3-goal gap. And that 3-goal gap only happened once, in Game 4, for only 1 minute late in the third period. Throw in a lead change or two at a serviceable amount of scoring chances per, and that's a decent series. It was that kind of series where every coin flip landed on heads after you'd made a promise to only call tails, and you watched helplessly as the gap just kept getting bigger, somehow without regressing to the mean. This was also Simon Gagne's last real playoff series, as he would sustain yet another concussion that basically ended up bottoming out his career. That's the only real blemish because it's tough to watch. Nonetheless, though, his squad won. But I can't help but wonder if just a few bounces went the other way, what kind of different outcome this series would have had. Ninth place on our list, while only ninth, for many Caps fans is the most important series in franchise history. It is Rocky in the arms of Adrian. It is Joshua standing in the ruins of Jericho. It's the Capitals slaying the Penguins, and for one time only in their incredible rivalry, getting the last laugh. None of these 3 consecutive series between the Caps and Pens are outright classics, but they improved in each successive year, culminating in this one. Another series which I knew the Capitals were gonna lose. Especially after the Caps gave up 3 goals in 3 shifts or something to lose Game 1. Game 2 didn't matter. It was the Pens playing with their food. But then, Alex Ovechkin scored an incredible mid-air goal despite being exhausted at the end of regulation to take Game 3. And I thought, well, hold on now. They might beat the Penguins. Cue a Game 4 loss. And then a storming from behind third period comeback win, not a loss this time, courtesy of Jakub Vrana in Game 5. And then, Yevgeny Kuznetsov. Really, Games 1, 3, 5, and 6 are prime viewing. Game 1 is every tired trope of this rivalry condensed into one game. Games 3 and 5 are just outstanding hockey, full stop. I love Game 5, man. It's probably my favorite win of the 2018 run, just for the build-up to the end, giddily knowing that the Capitals finally might beat the Penguins and are on the brink of moving on. And despite the Caps not leading the series heading into Game 5 and having lost Game 4, there was actually some cautious optimism. In the prior 2 years, at this point, they were down 3-1, but they had an extra mulligan this time around. They didn't need it. Game 6 is just one of those historical classics whose portentous value outweighs its objective merits as a game. The ending for this series is already spoiled more than most on this list, but the journey to get there will take you through all kinds of hockey highs and lows. And I'll leave it there, with you wanting more, to make you that much more likely to go and experience this series for yourself. Appropriately, 8 more series remain, and they are all of them incredible series, pulse-pounding, tense, you name it. And Alex Ovechkin and the Capitals had to live through all of them. A heartfelt, sincere thank you to all of my patrons, especially Connor Grindstaff, the first ever Seppo Repo tier patron, Pierre O'Connor, Nate, Jules, Jacob Keefe, Infernos Gaming, Steely Dan 32, Stuckmun, Sky Shiver, Pylon Zin, Ethan Johnson, Amazing Kook 143, and Eric Sheldon.